Hello and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're going behind the true story with Robert Wolfe. Robert is the author of Not a Real Enemy, the true story of a Hungarian Jewish man's fight for freedom, which tells the story of Robert's father, Irvin, before, during, and after World War II. That means today, we aren't going to be talking about just one movie. We're going to be talking about the way 5 different movies depict what life was like for Jews before, during, and after the rise of fascism in Europe and the Holocaust. So, before we go any further, consider this your content warning. Robert is currently in the process of trying to turn his book into a movie, so hopefully we'll get to see it on the big screen soon. But for today, let's start by getting a quick synopsis of the movies that we'll be talking about with Robert. And we'll start with that classic film, The Sound of Music, where we see life before and after Germany annexed Austria in 1938. And while that movie is famously about the Von Trapp family, Robert's grandparents were not far from all those events taking place, as they lived in Hungary just off of Austria's eastern border. After that, we'll chat with Robert about the 1997 movie called Life is Beautiful, which tells the story of a Jewish man living in Italy from the late 1930s and into the early 1940s as war breaks out. While the main characters from Life is Beautiful are fictional, the story of a Jewish man living in Italy during the rise of fascism parallels a lot of the anti-Semitism that Robert's parents and grandparents experienced as Jews living in Europe during that time in history. For our next movie, we'll pick up the timeline of the war in the 1940s with arguably one of the most popular movies to depict the horrors of the Holocaust on screen, Schindler's List. Unfortunately, that darkest of moments in human history is part of our story today too, because Robert's grandparents were murdered by the Nazis in Auschwitz. But during the darkest moments, sometimes there are beacons of light. Oskar Schindler's story being one of those, of course, but there were others. So we'll shift to a movie called Walking with the Enemy next, which tells the story of a Hungarian Jewish man who pretends to be an SS officer to save others from the atrocities happening in Hungary during the war. And since Robert's family is from Hungary, there are some obvious things that we can learn from that movie as well. And then last, but certainly not least, we'll wrap up our discussion with Robert today with the 1999 historical drama called Sunshine. That's an epic 3-hour-long movie all about multiple generations of a Hungarian Jewish family from before World War I through World War II, and then through the Hungarian Revolution in the 1950s. Similar to many of the other movies that we're talking about today, the main characters in that movie, Sunshine, are fictional. But as you've probably picked up by now, Robert's family lived through many of those very real events shown in the movie, including a post-World War II Hungary that saw a political shift from fascism into a Soviet Union-inspired communism. As you can tell, we have a ton to talk about today. But before we bring Robert on the line, there is one more thing we need to do, and that is to set up our game, 2 Truths and a Lie. Now, if you're new to the show, this is something we do on every episode to help you practice what the show is all about, separating fact from fiction. So I'm going to give you 3 facts that we'll be talking with Robert about today, but 2 of those are true. Can you spot which one is a lie? Okay, here they are. Number 1, Robert's grandparents converted to Christianity to avoid persecution. Number 2, Robert's dad was a 4-time escape artist. Number 3, Robert's grandparents watched American TV to get news of the war. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, listen closely to see if you can figure out which one is a lie. And if you're watching the video version of this, you can see I'm holding up an envelope, and the answer is inside this envelope. So we're going to open this at the end of the episode to see if you got it right. All right, now it's time to get a peek behind the true story with Robert Wolfe. We have a few movies to talk about today, but before we do that, let's start by flipping things around a little bit. Normally here on the podcast, we talk about things that filmmakers change from the true story, but I know you've been working to get your book called Not a Real Enemy about your father Irvin's story told into a movie. Of course, we can't predict the future to know when or if that'll happen soon, but let's hope for the best and say it is turned into a movie. So what's one key thing that you want to make sure the filmmakers don't change from the true story in the film adaptation?
Well, hopefully all of it, of course, but that's the easy answer. My dad's 4 escapes, for example, my dad was a 4-time escape artist, and he missed an escape too. He's fortunate enough to go to the wrong train station under communist Hungary, and everybody made that train got arrested, including his medical school classmate. So all of that, I'd like to be as accurate as possible, as cinematography,
Cinematography, yeah.
yeah, as close as possible. Color in color, obviously. A lot of the older movies are black and white, like Schindler's List, which I hope we talk about a little bit more. That movie, I just saw the movie, and it resonates very, very much so with the story that we're telling here. And then his upbringing, it doesn't have to be a long part of his upbringing. And if I could cast a movie, it'd be Tom Hanks playing my dad, and not Tom Hanks, Tom Cruise. Tom Hanks plays one of the nicer guards in the labor camp, the forced labor camp. A lot of the movie should cover the forced labor camp, the beatings, getting urinated on, getting shot at by Russian planes, all of that kind of thing. So there's a lot of content. And, of course, we want it as close as possible, but any good producer, writer, screenplay would switch it up a little.
Mm.
I just hope they keep keep the fidelity as much as possible. I mean, obviously you got to make changes to capture an audience, and hopefully that would be the case. And the other thing is, some people say it could be a feature film. Some people say a documentary, docudrama, a series. I wouldn't care as long as they did a good job with it. There's 40 chapters in our book, so you could. I don't think it'd be a 40 show series, but certainly 10 or 15 would be, one season's worth at least. So it's always up to the producer or whoever gets a hold of the story. It's not in a screenplay yet, but I leave that to Hollywood or whoever discovers whatever we're doing here, and if they do. So it's a wing and a prayer, and I know that it's such a long shot. It's easier to get into medical school, which I'm a physician. I'm a radiologist, recently retired. It's easier to get into medical school than to sell a New York Times bestseller or your story into a movie, as we well know. Nobody knew Schindler was, 20, 30 years ago, and nobody knew who Anne Frank was way back in the day. And the Life is Beautiful story, I'd never even think about Italy and the Holocaust until I saw that movie. And both of them the second time, both great movies. And we could talk about those details and how they resonate with what we're doing. And I'm glad I saw them after I wrote a book regarding the Holocaust, and beforehand too. What a different viewpoint, or what a difference that makes, certainly.
We're gonna talk about those for sure. But as we shift into some of the movies that have been made, there are a lot of movies that are set before and during World War II. So what I'd love to do is to get your take on some of those and how they compare to your family's experiences that you talk about in your book. And the first movie that I'd like to start with is a classic film, The Sound of Music. It tells the story of how life changes for the von Trapp family as Nazi Germany annexes Austria in 1938. And as we watch a movie like Sound of Music, it's possible to see the warning signs when we watch the movie now. But of course, anytime we're watching a movie like that, we're also looking at it through a historical lens, because we already know what's going to happen from history instead of being there in the moment. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Austria is like less than 100 kilometers from where your father grew up in Hungary. So he wasn't that far from where the annexation unfolded. What were things like in that region as Germany annexed Austria?
Well, as you know, the rise of fascism almost simultaneously with the Great Depression, the Roaring '20s were okay in Hungary and throughout the world. We think the war was over, things were doing well. And meantime, of course, Hitler was it was building the military machine that he was, because Germany's economy was that was their economy, was the military, of course. 1933 is where fascism was on a rise. In 1938 in Hungary, there were anti-Jewish laws were initiated. So you couldn't own a radio. You could only go out at certain times. There was no Jews or dogs signs up. Of course, Kristallnacht, if I'm not mistaken, in Germany, Austria was 1938, a very big event. That's where they started taking forced laborers, the young men that were healthy, they started taking them away to forced labor camps. And it really didn't affect Hungary. I mean, the anti-Jewish laws were there. So they were persecuted and shunned, if you will. But the killings and the most of it didn't really happen in Hungary until 1943, 1944. My dad ended up going to his first forced labor camp in 1943 in October, and then his parents were taken away to Auschwitz in 1944. So Poland got hit first, obviously, 1939, Kristallnacht before that, 1938, and then Hungary a little bit later. What I'm told, and from what I've read, Hungary had the fastest the fastest pace of homicide, of genocide, of any of them. So that includes Ukraine and Russia, which they were brutalized. And the Polish in 1939, the refugees went to Hungary, and the Hungarian government sent the refugees back, unfortunately, and it ended really badly for them. And so this resonates with Poland, with the Schindler idea too, because a lot of similarities between that and what happened to Hungary, although we're talking about 1941 versus 1943, 1944, but it could be the same idea that, a little bit different background, different scenario, but a lot of common themes.
Since you mentioned it didn't really touch Hungary, but it's touching all these countries around, and I've never visited Hungary, but I can imagine that the proximity isn't that far. I mean, there's borders. It's technically a different country, but there's these atrocities that are happening. What was it like for your father as a child and your grandparents, and when they're seeing it? I mean, they had to have been seeing it in the news. What's going on? Were they?
Well, what a great question. Well, you say seeing it in the news. We realize that my dad in Hungary and his parents never owned a car. They never owned a TV. You're bringing up a great point. Jews were not allowed to have radios. So they had a radio. His dad had enough courage to hide a radio, and they would quietly listen to the BBC during the uprising, with a lot of hope and a lot of prayer that it ends soon. And relevant to that, during my dad's first escape, they thought it was the end of the war. They didn't get much news at the forced labor camp, but they're in the middle of nowhere, but near the Austria-Hungary border. And even though they escaped his first of four, which is remarkable, they didn't know whether to flee to Budapest or stay in Hungary or go to Austria, because they didn't know who was going to win the war. And, if the Nazis won the war and they end up in Austria, they're dead men. And if there's a chance that Hungary, not Hungary proper, but the West, turns out it's not the West, it was Soviet Union. If they win the war, maybe they're better off in Hungary. It turns out either way, you're a Jew, you're screwed. I mean, those men, only 5% of the forced laborers survived in that process, including my dad, because he was on the run and hiding at the time. He wasn't. The rest of them that survived were treated as prisoners of war, unfortunately. So 5% of forced laborers, they had death marches, and that's why my dad and his friend Frank decided to escape the first time, because they thought they were on a death march. And nobody knows about death marches in Europe. They don't. I mean, historians might know. We all know about Okinawa and the Pacific, but not a lot of people know. So when they thought you weren't useful anymore, they killed you. So and that was true at the Danube, very end of the war. Unlike Schindler, where the guards just go home. I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes too, but it's a fantasy that these people, because the Hungarians were treated. And my mom and dad said that the Arrow Cross, for example, which is like a Hungarian Gestapo, and the White Terror, the Red Terror, Orthy, the Nazis, the communists, they didn't treat. If you felt like if you were Jewish, you were still scared of whoever was in charge. And the Hungarians, the police and the military treated the Jewish people worse than the Nazis themselves. And that's another thing that resonates with some of these movies too. Women versus men, women guards versus men guards, pets, a lot of things, humiliation. There are a lot of things to talk about that resonate big time.
I love that you mentioned the radio and the communications there, because that's something that I think, kind of like what I mentioned before, talking, when we watch a movie, we're looking at it with a historical lens. So we think of, oh yeah, you can get news from all around there. And in my question, I asked, seeing things, but there has to be that almost added level of fear, I would imagine, of not knowing, like, that there's some bad things going on, but you don't know the full extent of it. And then there's that fear of just not knowing, because then your mind would start to go make things up that, there were some horrible things, but it's something I have a hard time wrapping my head around, what it, like, put yourself in the historical context of what that must have been like. It had to have been just terrifying for your father.
Well, part of the reason, no intervention for many, many years after the war started, because the United States had for example, had the duty to protect its own citizens. So getting involved with a war, it was tough. Communications, I couldn't say it better. There were no cell phones, there were no lawyers, there were no courtrooms. The cops and the military pointing guns at you. And fortunately, in this country, that's not happened yet. So there's one thing: no communication, just the radio, which was illegal. It probably would have been shot and killed if they got caught with it. And in forced labor camps out in the middle of nowhere, even less communication than we had at regular camps here in the U.S. growing up. So word of mouth. Things got a little easier for the men, not much. But as their guards got bribed free dental treatments. My dad's father was a dentist, obvious threat to society, killed at Auschwitz, and his mom as well. And Dad didn't find out about until months afterwards. Another miracle from an eyewitness. And it's another point that the witnesses, besides no cell phones, no video, a lot of photographs taken, as we know. The Nazis took many, many photographs. So denying the Holocaust and even communist Hungary, there's no way. You can't sell that. But the witness was the next victim, is how it turned out, like at the Danube or in death marches, or as we've seen these mass burial sites in Ukraine, for example, or in the concentration camps. So the witnesses were literally the next victim. So very, very hard to wrap my arms around that. And like you said, very hard to get information.
Again, it's hard to wrap your head around, but putting yourself in that context of what that must have been like. I love, like, in your book when you're telling that story, it does a really good job of helping to put the reader in that place of what that must have been like in there. I'm curious because there are a lot of details of your father's earlier life. Were those things that he told you specifically, or were they things that you had to research after the fact, or how did that part kind of come together for that story as you're putting all these pieces together?
A little bit of both. I can't imagine the boredom, living in quarters like that, packed in with people, or even hiding out in your own home with yellow stars, yellow armbands, the anxiety, the depression, the fear. I can't imagine that. But like you say, you can feel it. Like during my dad's first escape. So, my dad and mom wrote an autobiography. They wrote his story from World War I, the end of World War I, to the end of the Hungarian Revolution. So literally 1916, 1917, 18 to the end of the Hungarian Revolution, 1956. They wrote the story in the 1970s. They wrote it as though it happened the previous day, sharp, crisp, and I turned it into a biography many, many years later. Growing up, the first half of my life, not so much, because I went to college and medical school, had a career as a radiologist, family, all of that thing. So I didn't, but I did read it went from paper and pencil to typewriter to computer to disc. And when it was a manuscript, maybe 30 years ago, I read it once and didn't think much of it and didn't remember much except my dad's first escape. But then when I reread it after my dad passed, unfortunately, my mom, a historian friend handed me the story on the disc, and I turned his autobiography into a biography. And just doing that alone, long story short, I went back to radiology, and that brought me to the book. And long story short, the stories were so amazing. At least 20 miracles in my dad's life in Hungary, 4 escapes and 20 miracles. I couldn't leave it on a computer. I couldn't leave it on a disc. I wanted to share it with the world. And so I did. And that's been my charge. It's been my mission the last 6 or 7 years. The book's been out a little while now, but that doesn't stop me from trying to fight anti-Semitism. So this is my main thing why I'm doing this. And but yeah, it's my own little corner. I need help with that, obviously. But no, my mom and dad, they did this as though they knew I would. Like, if you knew me 6 years ago, and my mom was a Holocaust educator, by the way, my dad too, but he was an OBGYN, by the way. He delivered 10,000 babies from the Detroit area, which is a form of redemption. That's the punchline. It doesn't bring back 6 million and doesn't bring back 50 million that died in World War II, but at least he brought some life back in. Jovial and jolly, no PTSD. My mom's, they educated, they were well-rounded people. And the stories, like I said, they were crisp. And then they had a lot of friends unlike what's going on in the world now, they had a lot of friends where I grew up in Michigan and throughout the world, from continental Africa, Asia. They had Indian friends, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, fellow Holocaust survivors. They shared the stories. And I bought into it. I got a little burnout from it. And then I brought it back to life, at least in my own legacy towards my family. So I got the zap, Superman's kryptonite. It just sort of called out to me, it summoned me, it beckoned me. So I'm doing it. And I couldn't leave this on a disc. I couldn't leave it on a computer. And so that's why we're sharing it. But very well done by my mom and dad, so.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you are telling that story because the world does need to know. And the part that kind of made me think that was when you're talking about the photos and things like the Nazis and the Soviets took. But again, putting yourself in that perspective, a difference from watching a movie today versus being there. When you're like the people that took the photographs to document a lot of that, those won't be photographs that your parents and grandparents would have had access to because they were taken by the people doing a lot of it. So it's not something that they're going to show. So I was very curious how that story then survives despite trying to be suppressed.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, very, very little belongings left over. from my dad's side of the family. My mom saved a lot of photographs, and somehow they were preserved. But my mom's, it was a little less harrowing. My mom was in hiding, either with her mom, grandma, uncle, grandfather. It was different, on farms and sometimes in Budapest. So she was able to preserve more things. And she also was into genealogy. And I wish I followed it a little bit more, but I do at least have back to World War I. I can't go back beyond that. But no, it's unimaginable the fear that my mom must have had in hiding too, and the fear my dad must have had every day, getting beatings, starving, and doing forced labor for hours from dawn to dusk. I can't imagine it. So the reality, and also photographs. The Nazis they took a lot of photographs. They sent them home to their families, let them know what they were doing. And I have a collection of about 18,000 photos on my phone, and some of them are exceptionally disturbing. The last guy surviving in Vilna, they're about to kill him, and he's surrounded by mostly Nazi officers. And there's a gun pointed at his head, and he knows he's next. Reminds me a little Schindler, too, we can talk about. But he's the last survivor there. A very disturbing photo. I haven't shared it because they'll probably kick me out of X and Meta and LinkedIn if I were to. The burning synagogue is another one. The smashed in homes, the burning homes. One disturbing one, well, they're marching off the Jewish people. And I'm thinking, well, who's taking a picture of all of this and not helping them? And these people lived in fear, of course. Another disturbing photo, I've got some from Jur, my dad's hometown. Very, very few available. Another one is Kristallnacht, where the glass is all broken up, and the lady's walking by the business smiling. I mean, how do you smile when you see that? Whether you're Jewish, you're not smiling. If you're Christian, you're smiling. Then, I guess I know what party you're in. You're in the Nazi party or the Communist party. They're very sadistic. And Christians were afraid for their lives too. So the ones that helped the Jewish people or the gays, homosexual, LGBTQ, disabled, they're to be lauded, including guys like Schindler, and Raoul Wallenberg is another one that comes to mind. So a lot going on. I can't imagine being so remote and secluded from the truth, let alone the news.
If we shift back to the movies, you mentioned Life is Beautiful, and that's another movie I want to talk about. That one starts in 1939, just after the annexation of Austria, and it follows the story of how life changes around a Jewish man named Guido before and during the rise of fascism in Italy. And the movie, it starts off with everyday life, but one of the key differences between Life is Beautiful and The Sound of Music that we talked about before is that Life is Beautiful shows how life changes for the main character because he's an Italian Jewish man, whereas the Von Trapp family in The Sound of Music, they're not. So while we see little signs here and there in Sound of Music, we can see the signs in Life is Beautiful. Those signs are clearly the rise of anti-Semitism that are going on in Italy. Now, in particular, there was a scene where Guido pretended to be an inspector of Rome, teaching children in school how they are pure Aryan, the superior race. He does it in a very comical way in the movie, similar to later in the movie when Guido's young son, Giuseppe, reads a sign in business window that says no Jews or dogs. And Guido makes a joke about others just saying, there's also a drugstore nearby saying, not going to let Chinese in with kangaroo, right? And just making a joke out of this very serious situation. And that storyline in Life is Beautiful is a fictional one. Guido's not a real person. But how well do you think Life is Beautiful did showing signs of anti-Semitism slowly growing in everyday life before the outbreak of World War II?
Great question. I mean, that's an hour answer, but fantastic movie, beautifully done. The cinematography is outstanding. I'm glad you mentioned that scene because to me, that's the turning point in the movie. The better part of the first half of the movie is about it's a beautiful life. It's a not that it's a wonderful life. That's a different, fantastic movie too. But life is beautiful. He falls in love with this lady. He's on the bicycle. A lot of humor. I mean, a lot of humor in that movie, even to the end. And it's admirable how he hides the truth from his son throughout. But yeah, that's the turning point in the movies when he's up there talking about the perfect race or however he words it. And then the poor, his relative's horse getting painted. I think it was green and purple. I forget the color, maybe green. That's good. And yeah, and then that's the turning point there. And then all of a sudden, boom, they're imprisoned and they're going off to concentration camps. Some different things. Some of the similarities with my parent. They don't talk about women that much, but both that movie and Schindler, the women guards, especially at Auschwitz and in these concentration camps, were to me, more sadistic and more brutal to the prisoners than otherwise. Interestingly, a lot of Nazis, the people that were guarding them were the Germans, the Nazis. So where were the Italians? That's a little bit different than Hungary, I think, because the Hungarians were the ones who keep an eye on the forced laborers. Until my dad's parents were taken from their home, that was a Nazi. Blue striped pajamas, interesting. It's a color, we don't know what color stripes they have in Schindler because it's a black and white movie, but it's blue stripes. But we all know that Auschwitz and other places they were red stripes. So that was another thing that was familiar, but or different, I should say. I thought one thing similar with both those movies is the language was a little fast for me. It's in subtitles, but I think they just talked a little bit fast. It was a little because we can read fast, but it was just a little uncomfortable, the pace of how they talk. Maybe at the very beginning, speed it up because it makes the humor scenes a little more humorous, so to speak. But they could have slowed that down a little bit too. What else are we? Yeah, I mean that's just a fan. The end was unbelievable. The way they say they won. They're playing in a game to win a tank, and they won. The kid survives, but he doesn't. The mom survives. Was it Dora? And of course, he gets shot. He gets shot for warning the ladies, including his wife, as they're being hauled away in a truck. So another thing that may not be realistic is the son and the father in the same bunk, because the kids were separated, like in Auschwitz and other places. In Schindler, the kids are hauled away in bundles, and boy, are the parents freaking. They're all running towards the fences and trying to follow the trucks, and talk about learned helplessness and seeing your kids being hauled away to who knows where. So that part may not have been as realistic, but yeah, it was such a well done movie, and I don't know that much about the Italian history in World War II. So that's that. But comparing to the other movie and to what I've read and done and learned about, pretty realistic. I mean, in their own way. Obviously, not every concentration camp is going to be the same. Not every forced labor camp is going to be the same. The different guards, different food supply. Who knows? Different amounts of sadism. It's people that take orders and people that delight in torturing others, and that's hard to put your arms around too. It's just I don't know how people could be like that at all.
Well, you mentioned Schindler's List, and whenever we think of movies that depict the Holocaust, that's probably the first one that does come to mind. In that movie, we see what life is like in the Jewish ghetto. Of course, Schindler's List depicts the ghetto in Krakow, Poland, but your grandparents were forced to move to another Nazi-controlled Jewish ghetto in Hungary. I'm probably mispronouncing that.
My Hungarian's nuts, so they never taught me, so it's fine. That was their super language.
But based on the research that you did for your book, were there similarities to what we see in Schindler's List in the ghetto there and what your grandparents dealt with?
Many, many, many. First, I want to talk about so many. I mean, unfortunately, the movie was in black and white, but the cinematography in that movie is unbelievable. Like I said, they talk a little fast, especially when they're talking about people's names. A little fast for me, some of the conversation, but amazing. Some overlap when they're taken to Auschwitz. We don't know if it's accidentally or if it's on purpose, and they put them in the chamber and they think that that's it, the gas chamber, and then they're relieved because it's showers. I can picture my mom, my grandmother in the gas chamber, and of course when they're on trains. When I visit Holocaust museums, when I do book talks and book lectures, I can't even go into it's hard for me to even look in the train, let alone go in the train, just because of that imagery. So that resonates. The dramatic irony, I guess I can get that in a minute, but the random shooting. Okay, so dramatic irony. I'm going to mention the three things first of all, the turning point is when they're horseback riding and they're randomly shooting all the people in the ghetto, the people that stayed, the people that tried to hide. Very, very sad scene because another thing that's not talked about is pets. How many did the pets get left behind? Did the pets get killed? And we know in Life is Beautiful, there's a little kitten is strolling around the clothes that were stolen. Another thing, and I'm going to go back to the dramatic irony. Another thing that resonates with all of it is the stolen luggage. They bring your goods, leave them here, and they'll arrive. Big deception. And when my dad's parents were all to Auschwitz, it was they were going to go to a forest or a farm, plant flowers, trees, do work on the foliage. That's how they were deceived, and they end up going to Auschwitz. So 3 points of dramatic irony, not necessarily related to my dad, but one is actually. So when the engineer, they're constructing the building, and the engineer comes up to, I think it's Amon Goth. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, or Amon Goth. He's the I think he's a lieutenant, but he's the most sadistic guy around. She says to him, the structure's not sound and we need to do this and maybe even start again. And what does he say? We are not going to argue with these people. And then he has the guy shoot her. And it's one of the few scenes where somebody gets shot and it's not him doing it. So amazingly enough. And then the irony is that he changes his mind and decides to take it down and start all over again. Another irony was the lady that comes to Schindler. I don't know if that was Helen Hirsch. Hirsch is how they pronounced it. I don't know if it's her or the other one, but she comes to Schindler and says, "Can you get my parents into the factory here?" And he says, he's practically screaming at her, saying, "No, I can't save everybody. This and that and that." And then a guy escapes from the camp, and Goth randomly shoots 25 guys, and then Yitzhak Stern, if I'm pronouncing Stern, they really did their best trying to do the correct pronunciation, and I think an accurate job. But Stern tells Schindler that 25 people died. So Schindler goes out of his way to bring in the lady's parents, which is pretty cool too. I mean, so the other irony, and that resonates with my dad in the forced labor camp, where an officer would get drunk, and some little piece of malfeasance, like somebody chirping a word or moving in the line, and the guy gets pissed, and he's got the gun, and he threatens to shoot every 10th man in his drunk state, and in the end doesn't. But imagine the fear, your dad, you can't see my dad, and everybody else counting 1 through 10, every 10th man they're going to kill. And the Goth does that too. He's got the whole line of the men, and he shoots the guy with the I don't remember if it was a gunshot. I think it was a shotgun, and then they shoot him in the head. And that scene is so vivid. The way that it was bleeding, it would have been even more so in color. But the irony there is the same thing. Just like when he randomly shoots the 25 men, and also the one person, and then he says, "Who's next? Who's next?" And then the kid's smart enough to step forward and said, Who did this? Who's the one who created the malfeasance? And the kid points at the dead guy, and probably saved a lot of lives just by doing that. So that's more irony. And then and comparable with my dad had to go through, threatened to be killed randomly, and thank God they didn't carry that out. The other piece of irony, which is almost redemption itself, is when I think it was the rabbi, it was one of the older men making the parts, and his productivity was on the low side. That compared to, it took him a minute to make the part. He says, "Well, you got such a few parts." So they take him out to shoot him, and his gun jams, and his backup gun jams, and he gets a gun from from one of the fellow officers or soldiers. I don't remember, it was an officer, and that gun jams, and there's 15 or 20 clicks where he's shooting this guy, and the poor guy's got his neck hanging down. He knows he's going to die any second. It reminds me of that the Vilna photograph, and then he ends up just hitting with the butt of the gun and lets him live. I imagine going through that kind of trauma and not having PTSD. It's amazing. But the irony is, when they hang Goth, they have trouble. They've got him by the rope, but they have trouble kicking out the step stool underneath them. It takes them at least like a half a minute. They can't do it, and the guy's. So that's a little bit of redemption too, but more dramatic irony. So it's a fantastically done movie, and so similar in its point. The trains and the POW or the forced labor, and we see forced labor, of course, in concentration camps too. Sometimes women, sometimes men. We don't talk much about forced labor with women in our story, but lately I've been taught and enlightened about that part of it as well.
Something that we don't see in Schindler's List much is how others in the city reacted to the ghetto being set up and the Nazis moving the Jews into it. How did the civilians in and around Europe react to the Jewish ghetto being established for when your grandparents were there?
Well, once they were in the ghetto, they had no access to the outside world. They had limited food, limited medical supplies. And my dad, being a dentist, brought what he had, but it wasn't enough. And ultimately, it was to carry him off to Auschwitz to kill them, most of them immediately, unfortunately. So I don't think they had much time to even think about it. But during, I'll say this, that they were shunned. No doubt it was hard to go out shopping without being bullied or picked on or even mugged. We talk about that or the fear of it. And also when my dad and his friend Frank were out on leave or whatever it was in town or in it, they were unkempt for one thing. They didn't have, my dad needed a haircut. And if you remember that scene, the anti-Semitic barber, but They had the yellow bands, those ridiculous hats that they had to wear, and yellow band, unarmed, paramilitary, and a couple of beautiful women walk by, and they won't even look at them. And believe me, the men they're dying to meet and be with a warm-blooded girl, and it just didn't happen. You were shunned. So, and it's learned helplessness. I mean, people feared for their lives for sure, and they did what they were told, and it's scary stuff. So, and then that reminded me of another scene where in Schindler, the young girl is yelling out, "Goodbye, Jews! Goodbye, Jews!" And it's awful to see that, because I think it reminds me of what we just talked about, the Christians turning on the Jews. It also reminds me of what's going on in Gaza, that these children are being educated to hate Jewish people, hate Israel, hate Americans, and that's got to stop. That really has to stop.
There was a scene in Schindler's List where we see the Nazis going and they're clearing everyone out of the ghetto to take them to concentration camps. You talked a little bit about that. And in the movie, the camp that they take them to first is Plaszow. And then later in the movie, we see Auschwitz, which you mentioned, and we'll talk about Auschwitz in a moment because I know your grandparents were there. But according to Schindler's List, seeing the brutality of the Nazi soldiers during the liquidation of the ghetto, that's what leads Liam Neeson's version of Oskar Schindler to start working with one of his employees. You mentioned him earlier, Ishak Stern, Ben Kingsley's character, to hire more and more Jews to help save them from being murdered by the Nazis. Were there any transformational points like this for the civilians in Hungary where they started to change their minds about what they're seeing about the brutality of the Nazis? Like we kind of start seeing it happening in Schindler's List with Oskar Schindler?
Well, great point. That's the turning point of that movie, if I haven't already mentioned, when they're horseback riding.
Yeah, they're
down at that. One thing that resonates too is the humiliation. The men, the rabbis, and the religious with the payas hanging down, and they're cutting it, and they're cutting their hair and laughing. So that kind of humiliation it was there. So humiliation we don't talk about as much. I think the Hungarians were, and Hungary gets mentioned later, that they were bringing in Hungarians to one of the camps later in the movie, and that was true. It was later in time, during at least a couple of years later. But that humiliation really resonates well. What else is it? The marching. The other humiliation is that Goth has his own personal woman slave that he ends up abusing. She gives the food and probably sex. There is sex. There is a sex scene or two in there, and of course at the end he beats her up, but she survives. But he beats her up, and it's drunk or whatever. It's the wine cellar. I vaguely remember that scene. But humiliation is a big thing about it. So. And then, of course, starvation is another thing that resonates. People didn't have food to eat. There was no trade. There was nothing coming in. So shunned is the best word. And like we said before, the witness was the next victim. I also remember Golf shooting randomly at people that were sitting down taking a break. And another dramatic irony: he has a kid cleaning out his bathtub, and he's trying to put the saddle on his horse. I don't know if it's the same kid. But the kid that can't put the saddle on the horse properly, it's right after Schindler talks about power and the power power if you can forgive. And he remembers that for a while. So he forgives the kid for the saddle. But then when he screws up using the wrong material to clean his bathtub, he ends up shooting him. And it's just what a sadistic guy. I mean, that was a guy who deserved to be executed without trial. I mean, so many witnesses. So that whole process. Of course, it's never going to be the same at every camp, but with people running around in fear that they might get shot or killed, or if they take a break, they're going to get killed. You can't. It's just it's unfathomable to what people had to think in their minds and stay strong while they're doing
it. Those types of things are, like you said, unfathomable. Like I'm trying to unravel a lot of this, but in our discussion here, but also there are just some things like there's only so much that we can do as we're talking here in this conversation that it's not there. It will never be enough. I mean, there's to tell the true story of it. And I mean, I've tried to put it in words, but I can't even do that.
Well, you talk about Christians, if we had Hamas tanks and armored cars, guns, tanks, then that horrible flag, in the streets here in Florida, or where you're from, Oklahoma, God bless, the heartland, we would be thinking differently. Then it would affect us more. Then we'd have a lot more fear. But it's patchy areas. It's Canada, it's Australia, different parts of the U.S. Anti-Semitic. So it's not directly in our face. But that's why I'm doing this, is so that it doesn't happen. I mean, that's why 99% of us are good people. 99% of us believe in work, family, occasional vacation, religion, if possible, whatever. The freedom to vote, the freedom of speech, is that 1% or less that ruins it for everybody. And not just Hamas, Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, Hitler, Pol Pot, the list goes on and on. We can counteract with better names: Jesus, Moses, Noah, MLK, Gandhi. There's a balance there, but we're still talking about hate and war rather than these other guys. I mean, unless you're staunch Christian or Jewish or Muslim. I don't think Allah meant for this to happen. I don't know. I don't know much about the Muslim religion, but I do have Muslim friends, and they're peaceful. And so what's going on? I mean, I can't get my arms around it. And the thing about this book and the story is my parents knew that it would be necessary to share it because they didn't think that the hate and the Jewish scapegoat issue would go away. And sure, they're right, 60, 80, 100 years. And the disturbing part is people find different ways to maim and torture, punish, kill each other. And it's really sad. And I can't feel that, because as a radiologist, we're into preservation of life, the beauty of the human body, the beauty of the anatomy, the cell, and all this training to go through it. There's no room for racism or prejudice in my field. But these people would think nothing about chopping your head off or killing somebody instantly. No respect for human life. And I can't wrap my hands around that either. It's just not, it's not what I was built for. And so we educate, we try to spread the word. We do podcasts, we do book talks, book presentations, TV interviews, in some cases radio. And we get the point across while sharing good stories, amazing stories.
Throughout a lot of, if you go back to Schindler's List, throughout a lot of that movie, it does recreate, I mentioned, Pashov and Auschwitz, where there were hundreds of thousands of people that were murdered. And unfortunately, that number also includes your grandparents, which is a very moving story told in the book. I think a lot of people base their knowledge of concentration camps today on what we see in movies like Schindler's List. But I remember the story of like the latrine in your book, and we don't ever see in the movie Schindler's List at all. So there's obviously other things there that we're not going to see in the movie. But based on what you know of your grandparents' experience, how well do you think Schindler's List does capturing the horrors of Auschwitz?
I think it's amazing. Like I said, the cinematography is amazing. The storyline and the brutality. We'll go back to the women guards that were tougher than. One thing that resonates. So, I mean, I don't like spoiling too many things, but a miracle that my dad found out what happened to his parents, an eyewitness who happened to survive Auschwitz and meet up with him in his hometown of Jura. I mean, all of those, that's a miracle after miracle that happened. But being in the train reminded me of my grandmother. The grandparents had never met, but my grandmother was an orphan, a little girl orphan, and they went straight to the chamber. So, and actually, truthfully, when I first did this project, turning it from autobiography to biography, I had to walk away from the book. I had to walk away from the story for at least a week, 10 days, because it profoundly affected me. So, and I hate to say this, but fortunately, she didn't have to. Her life didn't have to linger on for months at a time, and where you're starving and you're trapped and you're on your forced labor, and you don't know when your last day is going to be. Schindler, I think they capture all of that pretty well. I mean, everybody's going to have a different story, but it didn't go well. And then another thing that resonates is my grandfather, who was a dentist, who told the people at the intake that he was a dentist, he was a doctor, and he might be useful. So they assigned him to cleaning the latrines. And we don't see that in Schindler, but we sure see all these kids hiding in Auschwitz, including the one that he gets shut out by every other kid, and he ends up diving into the feces, and he hides in the latrine or whatever you want. It's disgusting. I mean, I can't imagine. What was the movie with the kid from India? He does the same thing. He ends up diving into the feces. And just the general. Oh. Remember that movie?
Yes.
And he's on Jeopardy or something.
Slumdog Millionaire.
Yes, very good. Thank you. I knew you would know. Yeah. You got a brilliant memory. I can tell. And that's good. I mean, I need more people like you helping me spread the message. This is why we're doing this too. But talking about great movies and a story that could be a movie. At least some people say that. So, so that resonates. Yeah. And then, so these were eyewitnesses. Well, at least my dad's parents